Thanks, Jason, and good morning to you as well. And that's the most common question we get is what happens to my license and when can I drive? And so a lot of times people, after their arrest, depending on what their suspension is for, whether it's a breath test failure or a breath test refusal, first question they always ask us is, when can I drive again? And that's the million-dollar question, of course. With any breath test failure, no matter what the offense is, first, second, third, it's always 30 days. Okay, so after 30 days, a person is eligible to reinstate their license. However, more common is when we have a chemical test refusal. And for a first offense in Massachusetts, that's 180 days, 6-month period. So in order to get your license back, you'd have to wait out that time, the 6 months. And after you did so, you would go to your local registry of motor vehicles that had a hearings office. Not every branch does. You have to look online to find one that has a hearings office. You go before a hearings officer, pay a $500 reinstatement fee, and you get your license back.
And I think it's really important that people know that the breathalyzer refusal or the failure has nothing to do with the court, right? It's just the RMV statutorily dealing with your license suspension. And I think a lot of people get confused because obviously there's also a criminal case involved. So I guess the other aspect of it is where we kind of tell people, like, should you reinstate your license or not? How long the criminal process is going to take? Because technically, after the 30 days, they could reinstate their license even while they have a pending criminal case.
And the first question I ask anybody in our initial consultation with clients or prospective clients is, how important is your license to you? And of course, that's a privilege that we all have, and it becomes a nuisance when we don't have it or we don't realize how important it is. But for those folks who did take a breath test and failed it, and it's perhaps a triable case, or there may be some issues with the breathalyzer, those people may want to wait the 30 days and reinstate their license and then continue on fighting the case. But you make a good point. There is a distinction. That initial suspension does not come from the court. That comes from the Registry of Motor Vehicles. We refer to that as an administrative suspension. Okay?
Right.
When we get our license, most of us when we're 16 and a half years old, we give up certain rights. Okay? And that's the implied consent law is that if we are requested by the police or any law enforcement agency to submit to a breath test and we refuse, there is an administrative penalty. And that's what I touched on earlier, is that for a first offense, that administrative penalty is 180 days. But there are ways to get that license back. Now that comes into the court process, of course.
Right. So let's run through one scenario. So someone takes the breathalyzer, fail it, but it's not a bad failure. It's probably like an 08 or 09 triable case. Right now, it's probably going to take them a very long time for get your case to trial, right? So after the 30 days, they reinstate their license, and then if they win their case at trial, their license doesn't get suspended. But if they lose their case at trial, that would trigger a 45-day license loss, and that would essentially restart the hamster wheel. But let's talk about the 180 days. So say if a client does not take the breathalyzer, now their license is suspended for 180 days. So they're not eligible for a hardship under the statute while their case is pending. What is the process that we go through to get them to drive as soon as they can?
Correct. So the quickest way to achieve that is to tender a plea, right? To plead the case out in court. And so a lot of times, sometimes we've done that arraignment. If people are proactive enough to hire us prior to having to go to court for the first time, we've been able to do that at arraignment. For the most part, people will go to court because, again, in Massachusetts, you're going to court the next business day after your arrest. So sometimes they just, they haven't had time to contact us or anybody, and so they're going in alone, which I think is wild. I wouldn't want to do that myself if I had never been through that process. I'd want somebody to kind of hold my hand, and that's what we do a lot of times is we assist people in that first hearing. So if they contact us after the arraignment, usually their next hearing is not for 2-3 months down the road, depending on the court. Now, I don't want somebody to wait that long if they're just trying to get the case over with and get a license. So we'd oftentimes advance the case, right? And oftentimes I'll do that 2 or 3 days after the arraignment. We coordinate and work out a plea agreement with the district attorney for a continuance without a finding. So it's not a conviction on somebody's scoring. It does count as a first offense, but if somebody finishes their probation successfully, it'll be dismissed in terms of their Corey checks, which is, an appealing outcome. The court will suspend the license further as under the law for a 45 to 90-day period. Typically, it's 45. But once that is done in court, after 3 business days, the person is eligible now, assuming they have the proper documentation ready, to go to the registry and apply for a hardship license, oftentimes called a Cinderella license. That is a 12-hour license that allows somebody to drive for a set 12-hour period for the duration of their suspension.
Yeah, and I think the important thing for people to remember is that the 45 days gets tacked on to the 180. So it's 180 plus 45 to get your actual license back. So you're going to need a hardship license for a good period of time. And also, I think a lot of pitfalls are, even though people don't mean to violate, but your license does not get automatically reinstated after the 180 plus 45. You have to go and reinstate it.
Right. There's an affirmative action you have to take. So once that 180 plus 45 has been served, you do have to go back to the registry. You have to go back to the hearings officer, and you have to pay a reinstatement fee at that point, which at that point is only $50. It's essentially as if you're just renewing a license that is going to expire. So, but in terms of the registry, you're usually paying upwards of $1,000 total to get your license back after the hardship and the reinstatement process.
And also, I know we talked about this many times before, but it's always a mistake when people go in and try to do it themselves, because even though continuous while finding, at the end of it will say dismissed on your record, it's not actually dismissed. It stays on your record forever. And what we've been running into is these are very difficult cases to expunge, and even very difficult cases to seal. And it will count as a first offense without the 10-year look-back rule now. Essentially, it's a first offense for the rest of your life. So it doesn't matter if you pick up a second offense 40 years from now. That can still be something that's a problem for you, especially with the registry. Even if the court decides that they want to treat it as a first offense, or you weren't charged with a second offense. But the RMV will not deal with that at all in the same way. So I think that's very important. But
it could be a whole separate talk about Melanie's law, which is driving law in Massachusetts, but there is a lifetime look back. While the courts would treat it differently after 10 years, the registry does not. The registry is going to look at any prior convictions on your driving record, be it from this state or any other state, and then they will administratively penalize you as such. So if you have 2 prior ones on your record from other states from 20 years ago, and Massachusetts charges you as a first offense in court, the registry is going to charge you the third in terms of the suspension. So there's always collateral consequences, and those are things that we have to look at when we're best advising clients what to do.
Well, John, great information as usual. On the next video, let's do some things about the subsequent offenses that can really trip people up. But also, if you're suspended as an immediate threat, that's a whole new ball game that we need to help people walk through. So thanks for coming on today. Let's talk again soon.
Thanks, Jason, and have a good day, my man.